And we're going.
Check 2, check 1. I do ramble. I mean, I move around.
You may not be in frame, but I got you in frame right now on that side of the podium.
So this is as far as I can ramble.
Not a whole lot further. But it doesn't matter as long as we can hear you. You just won't be in frame.
Nobody likes to see me. Are we ready? You're recording?
Yes, we're recording.
We're live?
It's going.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to my session at BSides. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm from Tenable Network Security. I work for Tenable as a strategist. My talk this morning, real briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself so you can figure out who I am and why I might be talking to you about pen testing. Sort of going to walk you through what got me thinking about pen testing and sort of walk you through some nagging questions that have been going through my head and infuse a little bias, give you my thoughts, conclusions, but really the goal of this talk is hopefully to get us thinking and talking about pen testing and the future of pen testing. Jason sort of stole half my thunder this morning, but that's not too bad. The last couple slides where he was talking about what to do about it and how to change things is probably, hopefully, where I'd like to focus on. So, I used to be a younger guy, and I used to look like that, so I used to be cool, and then I got lost a little bit too much where my wife said, really, it's got to go. So you can blame her for that. That's my information. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you want to dispute anything I say, have questions, talk, discuss. I'm more about the conversation because there are very few absolutes in this world, and there's a lot of room to talk about things and infuse ideas and suggestions. My background, I've been doing security. I was at ShmooCon last weekend, and I was hanging out with a bunch of guys, and I realized I've been doing security longer than they've been alive, and that was a little bit disturbing in some way for me. But I started out, is the EF here today? I'm not sure, but I started out at the National Security Agency. Spent 10 years there. I actually worked for the Department of the Navy for a little while. Been out in the professional commercial world for almost 20 years, and you can throw things at me if you'd like, but I spent 10 years being a QSA within the PCI industry. Go ahead and say it. But wait, there's more. A little bit about my DoD background. I'm actually, my one certification that I have that I claim that I have is in cryptanalysis, which came in handy in the PCI world when people started talking about encryption. I would ask for the details, and usually that's when they'd gloss over and have no idea what I was asking, so it made it kind of fun. I actually, the last couple of years that I was at NSA, I worked for an organization that at the time was called the Systems and Network Attack Center. I was there at the very beginning. And what we were doing back then, and this is before 9/11 and before the Patriot Act, but we were trying to develop methods and methodologies for doing ethical penetration testing, red teaming, to test the security of first the classified networks that NSA cared about, but then also unclassified networks. Other agencies started coming to us saying, well, you're the experts, can you help us test the security of our networks? So I was kind of in at the very beginning of that many, many years ago, and it says there, I don't like to tell a lot of stories and we don't have a whole lot of time, but we were branching out into non-DoD agencies to unclassified systems. And if I have time, if you want to track me down today and have one of those flasks, I might tell you a story about a DOJ incident that I was involved in. But anyway, that's some of my DoD background. Actually, it was in 2013, I think, there was an article that came out in Wired magazine. I don't know if anybody saw it. I think it was in the August issue, where they had headlines about, really there were some NSA people that cracked the crypto statute many years before a month before in Wired, they'd had an article about a CIA guy that done it. So in the article says in part that there was a group of NSA interns that were there and took the thing down, and I have proof. I was one of those interns. I actually still have the crypto's code that I printed out, and actually have a date and timestamp on it. So I was one of those interns. So my background, especially in the private sector, I came out to greener pastures, got a pay increase, which was cool. And people were paying me to break into their networks and do pen testing, vulnerability assessments, and so on and so forth. In the early days, I mean, the first jobs I did, it was convincing people they needed to have firewalls if they were going to be attached to the internet. And this is back in the days of Telnet, before there was Secure Shell. I did a lot of the pen testing over modem. Real men hacked with 14.4 modem. It's funny because I walk around with laptops now and I attach it to my my portable phone and use it as a device to the internet, and I feel like I'm reverting back to modem connection. I know it's screamingly faster now than it used to be. It just seems kind of weird. And then, as I said, the last 10 years or so, I got involved in PCI. I sometimes tell people I was exiled to PCI. I don't really know what I did wrong, but I ended up there. And I went into PCI with 20 years of security experience, which was good and bad. But I had many customers over the years that told me, wow, that was the toughest engagement I've ever been through. But thank you. We really learned a lot. I've been at Tenable for a little bit over a year. They brought me in initially to focus on PCI as a subject matter expert, and they basically just having me talk about security since I've been around for so long. And now I'm working for the strategy group, whatever that means. But some of the things I do is I do blogging. You can find some of my articles out on Wired. Their blog site's called Innovation Insights. I'm available for media quotes, which is kind of an interesting thing. I've been on a couple podcasts. I talked to White Rabbit the end of December. That episode aired in January. If you were at ShmooCon and didn't catch Security Weekly, the 402nd episode, we actually broadcast it from the lobby of the Marriott across the street from ShmooCon. And I have to hand it to the techies that are back up in Paul's studio. They really controlled the audio really well because we were saying and doing a whole lot more in the lobby of the Marriott than what came through. But it's in it. So I occasionally host the Security Weekly podcast since I've worked with some of those guys. But anyway, on to the talk. That's my background, just to give you some context. Hopefully, maybe he does have something to talk about. I went to DerbyCon last year, and it was actually my first DerbyCon because I said I was exiled in the PCI world. And when you're billable as a consultant, you very rarely get to go to any kind of training or conferences and actually learn anything. So one of the benefits of working for Tenable is I finally get to come to these conferences again. So I was there, and the keynote that was given by Ed Scotus was titled "How to Give the Best Pen Test of Your Life." So I found they have it up on their website. You can download it and listen to it. And as he was giving his talk, and these are kind of the points that he put forth. I'll let you read those in a minute. But as he was giving his talk, I was kind of waiting for him to give me the thesis statement. I used to do a lot of pen testing. I stopped doing pen testing a lot of years ago. And one of the reasons I stopped doing pen testing, Jason sort of reflected it a little bit this morning in his talk, but it gets frustrating when you go to a company time and time again, year after year, and you find the same vulnerabilities, you find the same problems, you get in the same way that you got in the previous year. And I kind of felt like there must be a better way to help companies secure their environment, help them become more knowledgeable and more educated and have a better posture than simply smacking them year after year, especially doing it the same way year after year. So what I noticed when when Ed was giving his talk was he never really talked about what was the goal of the pen test or what were the objectives of the pen test. Jason mentioned, I think this morning, the scope. He talked about how the scope is very often limited, and that's true. If somebody's paying you to do a pen test or to try to break in, whether it's physically or electronically, you have to put boundaries on it, and it's usually financially related at some point. There's other security concerns and not wanting to knock over production boxes and all that. But at the end of the day, the bad guys have all the time and the resources, and you have to do some sort of limited, measured engagement because they're only going to pay you so much. So heard all he had to say, heard the whole talk, and it just kind of left me hanging a little bit. And again, my underlying nagging thought was there's got to be a better way to do all this. So, the first question I asked, as I said, is, what's a pen test? What's the goal? When I used to go and do pen tests for companies many years ago, and I don't think it's changed a whole lot, they'd say, we want a pen test. And I'd say, what do you want to get out of it? What's your goal? What's your objective? Most of the time, when it came right down to it, they didn't really know what they were asking for. They just knew that it was cool and everybody's doing it, so they wanted one. But they really wanted to know about the vulnerabilities of their engagement, of their environment. The question I usually asked was, do you want us to just find a way to break into your network, or do you want us to find all the ways we can break into your network? And typically, I'll move back over here a little bit. Typically, they wanted to know all the ways. So I would explain to them, okay, well, that's more of a vulnerability assessment than a pen test. The rules are a little bit different, but we can help you with that. And we would proceed with the engagement. Very early on, I remember one customer we had, they had just bought, I want to say it was a Gauntlet firewall. They had put their people through trainings. Anybody remember the Gauntlet firewall? Thank you. A few old timers out there. The Gauntlet firewall, for those that don't know, was one of the first commercial firewalls, and it was based on an architecture that was written by Marcus Random, also a co-worker of mine at Tenable, and he's sort of sometimes credited as being the father of the firewall. He wrote the first code that became a firewall. So the Gauntlet was one of the first commercial. It was the big firewall. It's what everybody wanted to get. So this company had gone out, paid for it, installed it. They put several people through training, and they hired us, the company that I was working for, to do a pen test to see how well they'd done and to see if they'd set it up right. That's a great reason to do a pen test. Kind of test, your defenses. We think we've done the right thing. As we started looking at their network, and we were doing it remotely at first, it was a little puzzling because we couldn't tell that there was a firewall there. And the way we used to do our methodology was we'd start on the outside and see sort of what the perimeter protections were. And if we could break in, great. If we couldn't break in, we'd move to the inside and start doing some insider testing. And with the explanation that you have perimeter defenses, and that's great, but they could be compromised. Just because we didn't find a way to do it necessarily doesn't mean it couldn't be done, or doesn't mean there's other ways. And then there's that whole insider problem. And when we got on site, we very quickly saw that this company was being hit by a denial of service attack, and of course, we're the pen testers, we were being blamed for it, but we weren't doing it. So we took a timeout and we asked, can we look at your firewall rules? Back in those days, firewall rules were only maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 rules. So it was pretty easy to look at it, and lo and behold, the final rule, does anybody want to guess what the last rule on the list was? Any allow. So we were like, okay, we don't really need to continue this pen test because you sort of got this fundamental problem here in that you've misconfigured your firewall. So we sort of shifted gears, and instead of pen testing, we turned it into a vulnerability assessment. We did a lot of education and awareness. We ended up actually re-architecting their network and setting them up. So the point is, you can have a good goal and you can have a good objective, and it's important to know that, and it's important kind of to stick to it. But again, as Jason was saying this morning, so often the attacks work, you need to move on to the education and how to prevent it in a more cost-effective economic way. And this is sort of where I'm coming from the customer's perspective. So, back in the day, when I was doing it, and I don't know how much the language changed, because again, I've been in exile in PCI land, but most of the networks back when I was doing it initially were Unix or some flavor of Linux. So the goal was to get root. The goal was to get UID 0, to elevate your privileges. We used to do a root dance. I'm not going to show it to you. It's embarrassing. But we did actually, the team that I had worked with, we had our little thing that we did. But sometimes we'd get hired, can you get to this point? Whether it was externally or internally, can you get, this companies back then might have known where their sensitive systems were or what they were trying to protect. So it would be sort of a capture the flag exercise. Can you get to this particular point in our network? Sometimes it was wide open. How far can you get? Just tell us what's wrong. And in the early days of pen testing, and going back 20 years, a lot of times the pen testing was the first things that any of these companies had done in terms of security. So they were just trying to get a lay of the land, just sort of baseline how good or bad things are in our network. Over the years, and I even saw this sometimes in my time as a QSA with PCI, we usually start with a kickoff, and if there were the IT or the security people there, and if they said something like, "Wow, you can't do that," that's when we usually started salivating, and that's what we focus on. And lo and behold, that probably 99% of the time, yes, we could do what they said was impossible. Or they'd say, "We don't store that type of data," or "We don't maintain that type of data." And lo and behold, yes, they would. Yes, they do. And then finally, and this I think is still unfortunately one of the main goals or objectives of pen testing day, is to prove the point. There's some level of upper level management that doesn't believe us that are out there working, saying our networks are secure, they're insecure, they're porous, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to invest in this and invest in that. And we need to prove, so you can be hired and provide that proof. What I've seen changing though over the years, and this is part of the nagging question I have, is, like Jason's talk this morning, a lot of the videos he was showing, they weren't really technical in nature. It was, some sort of social engineering exercise, some sort of how, and I'm glad to hear that he has feelings and that he feels bad about lying to people, but it's a whole different art form and a whole different exercise. Yes, at some point it becomes a technical test, but it almost seems like, when I started, there was no firewalls. It was kind of easy. And then firewalls started going up and people started knowing how to configure them, so it got a little bit harder. Then we started looking at web servers. And we were doing SQL injection, if there is such a thing, before anybody called it SQL injection. But the way you got into the network after there were some perimeter defenses was you found the opening, you found the weakness, which was web servers. So it just seems like over the years, as companies have improved their perimeter postures, the rules have changed for pen testing to keep it fun, to keep it interesting, to keep it fresh. Not to say that the ideas are not legitimate, because there are insider threats, there is the idea of social engineering, there is the idea of the phishing attacks, convincing people that they shouldn't let people plug in USB sticks, making sure your own employees don't do it yourself. All these things are legitimate and all these things are valid, but it almost sometimes stinks, and I'm old enough to watch the original Star Treks, by the way, in black and white. But it almost seems like it's sometimes the Kobayashi maneuver. We're changing the rules of the game in order to keep the pen testing fun. And if you're doing it professionally, you want to keep being hired to do pen tests. You want to be gainfully employed, so you want to keep doing that. So is it cheating or is it changing the rules? And I'm just asking the question. So let me shift gears a little bit and bore you with a little bit of my PCI background, but it does tie in, so bear with me. Just to again say, I'm not the typical QSA you're probably going to meet. I've had some very fortunate experiences being a QSA. I used to work for VeriSign when they had a PCI practice, and I'm not even sure how they did it, but being part of that practice, we were invited in very often to companies that had gone through a major breach. So most of the companies you've heard of in the mid-2000s that were hit by Gonzalez, we were there as QSAs. These are just companies that I personally have been involved with QSA work. So, and these are, like TJX companies. They were one of the Gonzalez hacks. I was their QSA for 6 years until I came to work for Temple. Heartland Payment Systems. They were a service provider. That's a public record. I can say that I was their QSA. Actually, there's somebody here from Discover giving a talk. I'm hoping to catch up with him later. All different types of companies, gas stations, banks, insurance companies, e-commerce sites, flour companies, cookies. I come to Columbus the past couple of years, Cheryl's Cookies. Anybody have Cheryl's Cookies? They're PCI compliant. Barely, but they are. We talked about, well, no, I should go into details. But grocery stores, all sorts of different types, rental car companies, all sorts of different types of companies. And I'll tell you, all sorts of different types of companies that if it wasn't for PCI, they wouldn't be doing security nearly to the level that they're doing it these days. So you can hate PCI, but if you're in the business of providing services commercially, you really ought to thank PCI, especially if you're a pen tester, because one of the requirements for PCI is to have pen testing done. And there's a legitimate argument to be made that if it wasn't for PCI, a lot of these companies wouldn't be hiring out to third parties to do pen tests.
How to define the pen test?
Great question, and we'll get to that. If you've never seen it, the PCI standard, that thing you've heard about, is 6 goals for security, which I would argue, being in the business for 30 years, are pretty straightforward and pretty logical, broken up into 12 major requirements. And basically, it's you secure your network, lock it down as best you can, secure the systems and servers that go on the network, lock them down as best you can, maintain the security of them with a vulnerability management program that includes patching on a regular basis, implement strong access control measures know who your users are, limit their access to more sensitive parts of the network, need to know access, things like that. Regularly monitor and test the networks. That includes file integrity monitoring, intrusion detection, vulnerability scanning. That's a good word in for Tenable at this time. And pen testing is where that falls in there. And finally, everything you're doing, have it written down in an actionable information security policy, which includes policies, standards, and procedures. All the written stuff that everybody hates to maintain. So with that as my bias, and you asked what defines a pen testing requirement. Finally, in version 3 of the standard, which was put out about a year ago, and there's a break-in year, but now this is gospel, this is what it has to be. They finally, the council put together a little bit of a description. Well, these are the requirements for what should be involved in a pen test moving forward. And it's pretty decent. And it basically puts down in writing what companies that were taking it seriously knew that they needed to do. One of the big things about PCI is limiting the scope, so that companies would start segmenting their network, which is a great thing to do from a security perspective. Unfortunately, companies very often would do it just strictly from the PCI compliance perspective. So I always used to tell my customers when they were trying to de-scope things, what aren't you doing from a security perspective to this part of the network you don't want me to look at? Are you not locking the systems down? Are you not hardening them? Are you not patching them? What? And they hem and haw and say, okay, you're right, we probably should be doing that everywhere. But this says if you're scoping, if you're having an internal part of your network, you need to pen test all of it. And then they go on, here's your definition of a pen test, at least as the PCI Council puts it forth. The part that I agree with it the most is when you get down to the third, fourth paragraph, in terms of penetration testing should have a manual process involved in it.
My difficulty with these definitions is they always say you should have another pen test when a change is made.
Right.
What defines the change?
Oh, they haven't defined that one yet. Very subjective. Is installing a patch, is that a major change? Even if it's closing a major vulnerability. Yeah. It's not a perfect science. I definitely agree with that. But at least this is a start. And of course, the companies that are involved in selling PCI services are latching onto this and saying, "Oh, pen testing is new. You're going to struggle with this. You're going to have to hire other companies and do whole much more in terms of the pen testing." There's a lot of companies out there, and I won't say any names, mostly because I don't know them and I don't want to know them, that will have a fully automated pen test that you as a company can sign up for on a website and launch it, very similar to launching a vulnerability scanner. I personally have, having done this for over 20 years, believe in the manual intervention. Somebody there with a brain that's putting all the pieces, disparate pieces together and connecting the dots and trying to make it work. Or from a vulnerability scanning perspective from PCI, the PCI says remove all the highs and criticals, which leaves a lot of mediums and lows. The theory being that they don't directly lead to compromise. And if you ever read the descriptions of mediums and lows, they'll say, well, there's no known attack or there's no direct way to get this. But you can certainly connect the dots very often with a lot of information and find a way in. I think the presumption is you don't have to do the medium and lows within the time frame, but you should get to them eventually. But companies don't do that; they just leave them there. So anyway, what was bugging me about all this process is, let me go back. So my question is, if you're doing this already, which is building and maintaining a secure network, locking down all your systems and hardening your systems, patching, maintaining the systems, limiting access, all these things. If you're doing all these things, my first question is, if you're doing all these things, why do you run a vulnerability scanner? Because what's it going to find? All your vulnerabilities should be gone now. So the most correct answer to that is any new vulnerability that's surfaced between the time of the last scan and remediation period and the time you're scanning. There shouldn't be scans that are vulnerabilities that are older than the last scan that you ran. I understand that's not reality, but I live in a theoretical world. But then to take that to the next step, penetration testing. If your penetration testing is discovering that there's systems with missing patches, that there's systems with old vulnerabilities, that there's systems with default settings, that there's systems that don't have the default accounts disabled, that there's too many users, there's users that left the company months ago, years ago, and their accounts are still active, that there's bad passwords, weak passwords. You can go on and on and on. And these are ways that very commonly pen testers still have success getting in. But in theory, if you're following all the rules of the security program, and I'm using PCI as an example, none of that stuff should work. So clearly, something's not working. But my question is, why pen test if all that stuff's working anyway? Isn't there some other way to get through to customers to explain to them, and I don't have an answer for this, this is the question I'm asking. Isn't there something we could do better? And Jason, I think, said in his keynote that, he pointed to the audience and said, we're failing, we're doing a poor job of education. And I don't think it's necessarily us. I don't think it necessarily falls to us. I mean, it's a larger collective, but there should be something different that's going on. But in terms of today's world, why do people do pen tests? Why do companies hire pen testers? Number one, first and foremost, I think, is to meet compliance requirements. PCI says they need to do it, so they're going to do it. Very often, though, the companies really want a vulnerability assessment, and that's really what they're asking for. And I haven't pen tested it in a lot of years, but I've had to read a lot of pen test reports as part of the PCI process. And usually they're vulnerability assessments. The reports that I would read were time and time again, long lists of vulnerabilities that were various ages that need to be patched, remediated in order to get the passing result that you need for the pen test. But that's a legitimate reason for doing a pen test. In my mind, another legitimate reason to have a pen test is to test your security mechanisms, especially if you're outsourcing. If you outsource to a managed security provider, they're running your firewalls, they're running your IDS systems, you want to test it. We were doing that 10 years ago. We would be hired to test whether the intrusion detection systems that were in place were working or not, and more importantly, whether the people that were running them were catching the alerts and were responding to the alerts. So we'd sort of start off at very low volume, very slow and methodical, and gradually turn up the volume, turn up the noise, and kind of wait to see. It's almost kind of like a blood pressure cuff. Just keep putting the pressure on to see when they actually notice. Unfortunately, very often they would never notice. We'd end up banging pots and doing things very loudly, and they still wouldn't notice. And then the other legitimate reason, which I think is mentioned a lot, is the whole idea of education and awareness. So insert Jason's last 3 slides there. But what I think pen testing should be and could be is something beyond that. And I sort of only came to this conclusion as I was putting these slides together, asking this question. And the conclusion that I drew is that maybe perhaps the pen testing that's done, and again I'm idealistically thinking all that other stuff's been done already, and companies are doing pretty decent jobs of all what I think most of us would consider basic security, then maybe the pen test should focus on threats and threat agents. Maybe pen testing should be about what happens when somebody does try to do the thing that you don't really think that anybody should do. The analogy that I would give to customers as I talk to them about this sort of idea is, I don't know how many people fly on airplanes regularly, but before 9/11, getting through airport security was significantly different than getting through airport security after 9/11. And then a few years later, there was that guy that tried to blow up a plane by putting a bomb in his shoes, and so now we all have to take our shoes off. But before those things happened, people didn't think about those types of things, so there wasn't defenses for those types of things. And it's been so many years now since 9/11 that it's almost getting back to the way we were. I used to travel a lot before 9/11. I lived near an airport. I could leave my door and get to the airport, parked through security to my gate within an hour. So I would leave my house an hour before departure time. And I don't do that anymore. And shortly after 9/11, you had to add 2-3 hours and wait in long lines. But I've noticed recently over the last couple of months, and I still leave early, but by the time I leave my house, get to the remote parking lot, take a shuttle to the airport, go through security, and I don't have the TSA pre-pass. I'm still sort of in the lines. But I get through security, get to my gate. Very often, it's been less than an hour. So we're somehow reverting back, even with all those things that are being done. That disturbs me a little bit from one perspective, but I'm happy as a traveler that the process is going a lot quicker these days. But airplanes didn't have all that extra metal on the doors to the cockpit until after 9/11. Most of security is defensive in nature. We figure stuff out and we have a defense for it after it's happened once. And that's really going back to the PCI standard, which has something like 400 controls now. Just about every one of them is based on it already happened, and so we have to write a security control for it. So anyway, The theme of Ed Scotus' presentation was how to get the world's best pen test. And I thought to myself, what would be the world's best pen test in my mind? And this is what I came up with. You have a solid testing methodology, you know what the goals and the objectives are, you have a beginning and end, and of course, and I'm stealing from him, you have all the time and resources you need, which doesn't exist. You always have to put boundaries on it. You try to do stuff that's real, mimic real-world scenarios. You account for everything, and this is something I wish more people would do. You have a documented methodology, and your reports actually write up what was failed, what you tried and it didn't work, as well as what you tried and it did work, so that if I'm receiving that report, I know what happened. But ultimately, in my world, this ideal world that I live in that I know doesn't exist, a proper pen test against a company that's got a good security posture wouldn't yield any results. So in my mind, the perfect pen test is one that fails. Think of that. It will never happen. So anyway, these are some summary points, just trying to put together the thought tab, and if we have time, we can hopefully have a discussion. We have time. Okay. I'll wrap it up quickly so that hopefully we can have questions and discussion. But I think instead of pen testing being very commonly and too often vulnerability assessment, I think it should be focused more on threats. And we should somehow try to figure out methodologies of pen testing that move more towards threats rather than vulnerabilities. Of course, that implies that vulnerabilities have been remediated and addressed, which I know we're not there yet. But if we can, and this is maybe where I do get a little bit preachy, if we as an industry continue to promote pen testing, and I work for a vendor that has a vulnerability management tool, or vulnerability scan engine, if we continue to rely on the tools and the technologies of vulnerability discovery being the things that should be happening at the end after we've done a lot of stuff, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot as an industry, as companies, but as practitioners within the security industry, I almost feel like we're codependents. Yes, it's fun to pen test. Yes, it's fun to find stuff and break in and do all these things. But if we allow for and enforce the starting point being vulnerability discovery, I somehow feel like we're contributing to this, sort of the opposite of what Jason was saying, the promoting the uneducation rather than the education, promoting I forget what his other two words were. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Think about it. If we get all behind the pen tests that are vulnerability assessments essentially, and vulnerability scanners, tools, whatever they are, that are providing all this vulnerability information, and if we continue to rely on that as the starting point for, now let's talk about how bad your network is and what you should be doing, we're never going to get out of that loop. And I've been in the business for 20 years commercially, and we're never in the loop. And just to put a plug in again for Security Weekly, the 402nd episode that we broadcast from ShnooCon, that was sort of the theme of the episode was, we seem to be talking about the stuff that we were talking about 20 years ago, and the same type of issues keep coming up, and we're not doing any better. And I've talked to a lot of old-timer people in the industry that I think we all pretty much agree, nothing's ever changed. We keep, and it's not even a cyclical thing, we're not getting any better collectively at doing any of this stuff. So that's where my head is. Feel free to agree, disagree, ask questions, discuss. Anyone?
The idea of pen test being required after any kind of change, and we have no definition, as you were saying, of what that change should be. Right. Really, just in the same idea of vulnerability assessment, it's only as valid as the time that it's being taken, right? So right. The following day, things could change radically. So, what, in your opinion, I know we talked about this already, but what, in your opinion, would be a good enough reason to declare that you need another penetration test, being that, seeing how they're not necessarily economically viable?
We are dealing in the theoretical, so I guess we can answer that. I was going to say, in the 10 years that I was a QSA with BCI, I never had a customer that presented an out-of-band pen test result to me. It was always the requirements once a year, boom, that's it. I think hidden in the definition that the PCI Council put out, there's a statement about part of the methodology should involve sort of lessons learned or things you've experienced over the last year. I would say if you had an event, if you had some sort of compromise, if you had to trigger your incident response plan to any degree, I think that would be a good reason to launch a new pen test. Again, the whole nature of security, whether it's technology, information security, or any type of security, it's always defensive in nature. So, in the last year and a half, where there've been huge vulnerabilities discovered, and this is really where I started thinking about it, where working for a company that was rushing to put out new plugins so that certain things could be detected, because so many of our customers were clamoring for, do you have a way for us to find this vulnerability in our environment? I kept thinking, why don't they know if they're running certain protocols or certain configurations that these things would be present in? Why are they doing discovery when they should know what they have that's running, let's say, OpenSSL? So they know where to look for if they're vulnerable to shell shock, that type. So events, big industry events, big vulnerabilities like that come out, that's probably a good reason. I'm still trying to get my head around, and I haven't found any good definitive information of how, in the last year and a half or so, the bad guys are being so successful getting malware into so many retailers and merchants. So many of these companies have been in the news of having these major breaches. Everyone individually, every company individually will have some degree of it's out in the public of where the attack came from. All of a sudden, it seems like the bad guys have gotten really good at some technique that's getting malware into these places. And I don't know that it's just they found, for every 100 companies that are out there that have been compromised, they found 100 different ways to get in. I suspect that's not the case. I suspect there's something that they found that's really working well. And I don't know what that is yet. But that makes me nervous, and that makes me think a pen test should be launched to do even some of the things we've read about in the news. Third parties. I think Jason mentioned how he didn't get the target directly. He got a third party charity company that was attached. That's certainly been in the news the last year. So even a pen test, and I don't think it's in the methodology. Take the pen test from the vantage point of any attached third party. That would be a good pen test, and that's something if you attach a new company, you should have a new partner do a new pen test. And I'm just one person. If anybody else has ideas of when you should do a pen test other than once a year, feel free to throw it out there. Yeah.
Based on your approach of current pen testing standards and methodologies and your ideal approach, why is there a need to separate that one or the other? Why can't we have both?
Well, I think realistically we do have both, and realistically we have more of the former rather than the latter. I think because I think we don't do well with the education and preparing companies for all the things that they should be doing before the pen test happens. And companies are mostly for-profit companies. They don't want to spend much on security. They want to spend as little as possible. They want to spend as little as possible on IT. And they certainly don't want to spend money on these things that don't produce anything more than a report. They'd much rather have a product, something tangible that they can put their hands on. So they they need to invest more, but they need to be convinced of that, but they need to be doing more, and the doing more isn't sexy and fun and neat, and it's not something you can go out and buy and do it. It's diligence and awareness and doing all that fun stuff that none of us likes to do, like writing stuff down. And I'm getting the cutoff signal, so our time's at an end. Thank you, everyone.